Welcome to the African News Review podcast, where we cut through the noise and get to the truth. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and each week we are here to challenge the biases, prejudices, and misinformation in the Western press about Africa. Using historical context and contemporary insights, we set the record straight and reclaim the narrative. Tune in every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we uncover the real stories and reshape the conversations about Africa. This is the African News Review podcast, reclaiming Africa's narrative, one story at a time. Yes, greetings, and welcome to African News Review special. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla. With me, as usual, is Aya Fubara Eneli, Esquire. She is the author of Yourself Revolution, Kwanzaa, a Celebration Guide, host Rethinking Freedom on 98.5 FM, Killeen, Texas. And she's also the co-host of Women and Resistance. Welcome, sister.
Thank you. Pleasure.
The comrade is our Jegna, as they would say. He is Comrade Milton Allimadi. He is the author of Manufacturing Hate. He's also the host of Black Star News on WBAI 99.5 FM, New York. Welcome, comrade.
Asante sana. Thank you. Thank you to everybody.
Yes, we've advertised the gentleman will join us for a week, and I'm pleased to announce he's here. He is none other than Professor Hakim Adi. He's an award-winning historian whose work has been translated into multiple languages, and he's also the first historian of African heritage to become a professor of history in Britain, where he was appointed the professor of history of Africa and the African diaspora at the University of Chichester in 2015. In 2018, he launched the first world online Masters of Research in the History of Africa and the African Diaspora. Unfortunately, in 2023, the University of Chichester decided that was no longer a cause for them to travel. In 2024, Professor Hakim Adi was the recipient of the Outstanding African Studies Award by the African Studies Association UK in recognition of his exceptional contribution to the field of African studies for expanding and disseminating knowledge on Africa. In April of 2025, he was awarded the Amilcar Cabral Centenary Medallion by the Fundação Amilcar Cabral, which is in Cape Verde, for his work honoring the memory of Amilcar Cabral, another legend of ours. He has written multiple books, and the one we are going to focus on today is Pan-Africanism, a History. And just type his name into your favorite search engine. His reams of books will come up. Thank you, Professor Abdi, for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for such an extensive introduction. Much appreciated.
No, thank you. Thank you for the comment. And so, yes, the question is, we have Dr. Abdi here, and Pan-Africanism is, depending on who you ask, they often have multiple definitions. Nobody has a settled understanding of what the phrase means. And so, for primer, could you give us an idea of what it is we're looking at when we say Pan-Africanism?
Yep, that's a very good question. As you know, I've written a whole book to try and answer that question, but I will try to give a short answer. Pan-Africanism is, I suppose, really the striving of Africans, including the African diaspora, to meet the particular challenges that Africans face at any one time. So it's unity in action. As I say, it takes on different characteristics at different times. It's based on the fact that there is a division of Africa, if you like, a modern diaspora was created. There are lots of diasporas, but a modern diaspora, which was largely the result of human trafficking and the impact of the imperialist system of states and colonial rule and so on, which divided the continent and divided Africans from Africans. So at the end of the 19th century, various representatives of those in the continent and those in the diaspora got together in order to deal with the challenges that they faced at that time, and the modern Pan-African movement was born. We could add that obviously it's a concept which is concerned with unity, with struggle, and with the aim of the liberation of the entire continent and of all Africans. So we could say that are some of its goals. In the book, I describe it as a mighty river with many different streams and currents. So it's not one thing, because the challenges that Africans face changes over time. And also people have different orientations, different perspectives and so on, but all of them ideally feeding into this great river, which we can say will bring about the liberation of the continent, the unity of the continent, and the liberation and unity of Africa and its diaspora. So although I kind of indicated that the modern movement began at a particular time, that doesn't mean to say that there weren't manifestations of Pan-Africanism before the 19th century. It's just that the word wasn't in usage really before that time. But we can go back to the, 17th century, but maybe even beyond, and there are various landmarks within that history. And one of the most important, I suppose, would be the revolution that broke out in the French colony of Saint-Domingue in the late 18th century, when 500,000 Africans speaking different languages coming from different parts of the African continent were trafficked to the Caribbean, united, overcame their differences, fought for 13 years, defeated the three principal armies of Europe, the British, the French, the Spanish, and liberated their country, liberated themselves from enslavement, and brought into being the first modern African state, we can say, although located in the Caribbean, and ushered into being the first modern definition of human rights in the same time, and did many other things as well. But there are many other manifestations, but that's one of the most important, and it shows us that the struggle for liberation can also take revolutionary forms. I always say revolutionary forms are often the most democratic forms because they require the mass participation of people. So that, in a kind of nutshell, is what Pan-Africanism is all about. And of course, more recently we can say, forms of state Pan-Africanism. In other words, the cultures of Africa coming together in various organizations. The Organization of African Unity in 1963, the African Union at the end of the 20th century, which as part of its existence, although it's an organization of African states, also includes the entire diaspora as its sixth region. So these are all manifestations of Pan-Africanism.
So, Professor Adi,
Yeah.
In addition to the mass murders, the physical damage and destruction of slavery and colonialism, could you talk a little bit about the psychological and mental damage that seems to have lingered for a very long time, and that also is one of the obstacles in really getting many of our people to appreciate the importance of Pan-Africanism? Because it's very difficult to involve yourself if you have not yet come to the belief that you are actually worth what you should be. So maybe you could speak a little bit about that as well.
Well, I suppose one of the sort of accompanying features of human trafficking, enslavement, colonialism, and as you say, something which still is a legacy of that period in our history, is the whole issue of racism and Eurocentrism. So racism is, again, people are familiar with it from their own daily experience. Eurocentrism being one particular manifestation of it. So one of the features of racism is to present the view that, for example, only certain people in the world have a history.
Right.
Only certain people in the world can determine their own affairs. Only certain people in the world are capable of governing themselves, that certain people in the world are inferior to other people and so on, that some people in the world don't have a history, and so on and so on and so forth.
Yes.
The other aspect of Eurocentrism, which is a very troublesome one today, is the view that there's only one way of doing things. There's only one political system. There's only one economic system. There's only one way of thinking about the world. And that is the Eurocentric way of looking at things. So these are very, very damaging generally. So then within that, within all of these, we can say this kind of disinformation, which is around, that has one of the effects it has is persuading people that there's no alternative to what currently exists. If you live in the US, this is the greatest democracy the world has ever seen, and you should be extremely grateful for that opportunity. If you live in Britain, you live in the country which introduced democracy to the world with the mother of all parliaments and so on. This is, a political and economic system that's been honed over centuries, and isn't it wonderful, and so on and so forth. And people should do nothing about their existence here.
Right.
If you live in Africa or in the Caribbean, you're told, well, the political and economic system you have has been brought from a superior civilization in Europe, and that this is all there is, and so on. So all of these ideas, and there are many others, too numerous to mention, have the effect of, if you like, you could say putting people to sleep. One of the most pernicious, obviously, is the whole system of representative democracy, which tells people that you don't need to be decision makers because there are these other people who are highly professional, and they're there to make all the decisions for you. And all you have to do is put a cross on a piece of paper every 5 years, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the highest form of democracy. You've given these other people, your representatives, they're often called, the power to make decisions, and you can sit back and do nothing. So all of these things have an impact, not just on Africans, have an impact on people in general, that they don't have the right to determine their own affairs, they don't have the right to make decisions, that things can be done through the existing machinery, which might be a little bit imperfect, but that's all there is. And the important thing that history teaches us, which is why so much effort goes in by the powers that be to deny history, the history of Africa, but also history in general, is that history teaches us that nothing remains the same. Everything is undergoing a process of change continually. Secondly, it tells us that history is made by people. We are the history makers. So I usually like to say or used to say to my students when I had a job, that history was the study of change. And it shows us that human beings are capable of changing things. And in fact, this change is continuous and inevitable and so on. And if we can only organize ourselves as the people in Saint Domingue in Haiti did at the end of the 18th century, then we can transform everything. So the powers that be spend a lot of time, trouble, money, effort persuading us that the reality is something different than our whole experience tells us that it is. And even so, people are continually striving for that change, are organizing, are protesting, are engaged in a whole range of political activities. But what people need to be thinking is not just that we should always be protesting, but that we should find ways to become the decision makers. So all of these problems that confront us, whether it's the weight of the imperialist system of states in Africa or the Caribbean, or the weight of that system in the United States or Britain, this can actually be removed. It can be removed. We can become decision makers. We can make decisions for ourselves. We can have economies that are people-centered. We can have political systems which are people-centered, and where we can make decisions about everything. What kind of health system we have, what kind of education system we have, whether our country goes to war, whether our country exploits other countries, all of these things. This is 20th century. We're all literate. We've all been to school. Many people have even been to university. We've got the technology in front of us to make decisions about everything. So the idea we should have a political system that began in the 17th century and doesn't work, has never worked, and certainly doesn't work in Europe, and therefore should be imposed on Africa, the Caribbean, and everywhere else is nonsensical. And so awakening is very, very important, and that is the role of political organizations and so on, to enlighten people about these questions. Those of us who are historians, we also have a responsibility to enlighten people about the historic truths and so on and so forth. And of course, where Africa is concerned, the notion that we should adopt the political and economic systems of the exploiters, of the colonial, is even more ridiculous when
it's insane.
Africa is the continent with the longest historical tradition of political institutions of all kinds, from the most democratic to the least democratic, you could say. The first states were developed in Africa and so on. So there's so many traditions and ideas to build on and so on and so forth. But these are the impediments that are at the moment in the way, but I'm sure will gradually be removed. That's really the great task of the 21st century, for people to empower themselves and to make these decisions. And in Africa, we've seen the beginnings of that in the periods of the liberation struggles. Cabral was mentioned in the introduction, and he was a great exponent of these new forms of democracy, where people make decisions at village level, at regional level, even at national level. Everybody's involved, literate, illiterate, and women, etc., etc. And there are other places as well. So we know, if you like, what the future will look like. The question is building it with the whole weight of hundreds of years of suppressing people's ability to make decisions and so on. But anyway, that's a rather long answer to your question about.
No, it's a very appreciated answer. I think it's a thorough answer. Sister Aya, welcome back, Adesoji.
Yeah, I got chucked out.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Just taking a quick break here on the African News Review podcast, but don't go anywhere. If you're enjoying our deep dive into the real stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern, we're here to debunk the myths and bring you the truth about Africa. Want to help spread the word? Share this podcast with your friends and leave us a review. It goes a long way in helping others discover the real Africa. Without further ado, let's get back to setting the record straight.
Professor Adi, your research has been distinctive in insisting that 20th century Pan-Africanism cannot be separated from its entanglement with international communism and those labor movements. It's interesting that your book is titled Pan-Africanism and Communism, where a lot of times we see it as versus Pan-Africanism versus communism. And you've talked about these streams that we hope will flow into the same river, but then the impediments. And I was just wondering if you could enlighten us further on what happens when the popular retellings of Pan-Africanism strips out class, and even with the book you published in 2013, I believe, even erases women in their role, and how you will critique what we're currently doing, or what we've lost politically when that economic and class critique is stripped out, when women and their role is pretty much erased, and how Pan-Africanism today may still be suffering from the same de-radicalization from earlier eras.
May I be rude enough to interrupt before you respond?
Sure.
Because, whenever people hear the word communism, millions of Americans don't even really know what it means. but they have that natural instinctive abhorrence. This is the death of I if I don't do something about it. I mean, I've always wondered if we were talking about the same philosophy and theory, but we did not have the word communism, would it be much more embraced if people actually knew what the particulars were? So I just wanted to throw that in as a spoiler there, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean,
To the question.
that relates to my last answer, which is that the powers that be spend a lot of time and money miseducating or diseducating, whatever word one uses, people about these things. And they spent, the last 150 years or wherever we are now, nearly 200 years, demonizing communism and the ideas. We only have to see the attempted genocide in Cuba at the moment to see that the US is going to smash something which they recognize is a model, not just to the Caribbean, but to the whole world, a relatively small island with all, has its difficulties, its problems, its own history. But up until the tightening of the genocidal blockade, they had one of the best health systems in the world, one of the best education systems in the world, one of the best cultural environments, sporting environments, et cetera, which is the only country in the world which exports health professionals, doctors, and to the whole world, including the United States itself.
Exactly.
Doctors from all over the world, which has never invaded anybody. So this is, you could say, an example of this ism, which the powers that be, and particularly the US, take great exception to. And I know that, people in the Caribbean, for example, in most parts of the Caribbean, people have been aided by the Cuban, medical professionals, but lots of other countries have as well.
Right.
Well, yes, we have to. I mean, there's a famous quote, isn't there, from Assata Shakur about what she believed, how she'd been brought up to think of this, and it was men with beards or whatever it was. Can't remember. And she was schooled by Africans who explained things to her. But yeah, I mean, communism is technically a condition. Communism is a condition for the liberation of the wealth producers, or workers, if you like, those who produce all the wealth. So it's a condition for their liberation. So this is a condition for the liberation of the vast majority of people in the world. Who is going to object to that? Well, those who exploit the vast majority of the world, the few are the millionaires and billionaires. Yeah, they're going to object to that. But the vast majority of people, if you explain that, that means that the majority of people empowering themselves and becoming decision makers, and particularly deciding what happens to the wealth which they themselves produce. So this is very, very. So yeah, to go back to the other question, the other issues. I think with the role of women, or rather than the role of women, the existence of women, and the denial of the existence of women. I mean, is what can you say? That it's rather like complaints that, Eurocentrism attempts to deny that Africa and Africans have a history. So there's another pernicious trend which tries to deny that women have a history, and particularly that African women have a history. But of course, as African women are the majority population in the African continent, it's obvious that they do have and continue to have a history. And how could you understand the history of anything or anyone or any place without understanding the history, the role, the significance of more than half of the population? It makes no sense. In the history of Pan-Africanism, the modern Pan-African movement, we can say, was founded by a woman. Alice Kinloch was the founder, the inspirer of the modern Pan-African movement. She was a South African woman who came to Britain at the end of the 19th century, inspired Henry Sylvester Williams and others to create the African Association, which then went and convened the first Pan-African Conference in London in 1900. So she really is the mother. Yeah. And it's significant that she was written out of that history for the best part of a century, and has only kind of re-entered very, very recently. But what is the purpose of this kind of rendering of history? Even with the Congresses, the Pan-African Congresses that W.B. Du Bois organized in the 1920s, any of them, in fact, probably most of them, were actually organized by women. The 1927 Congress in New York was entirely financed and organized by women. The previous Congresses he organized in Europe, also women played a very important role. So these are just facts of history which should and must be recognized. And again, just as the writing of working people out of history has its influence on people's thinking, the writing of Africa out of history has its influence on how we think. So the exclusion of women or the writing of women out of history has its impact on how we think about things. And it's very important to challenge that. I think the issue of, class, as it's referred to, is, again, it's just an understanding of history, that history doesn't kind of move in a straight line. There are contradictions and conflicts between people, and very often these are concerned with those who have and those who have not. And that was true in Africa as anywhere else. If we, in some instances, not in all instances necessarily, because there were different societies, some were much more equal than others. But wherever you have kings, for example, you have inequality, generally speaking. We all like to...
Ikwema will definitely agree with you on that.
There you go. We all like to talk about Mansa Musa and, how he had all this gold and this and that. But we don't say, where did it come from? How did he have all this? Who were the people who mined the gold? How did he accrue all this gold? When we want to talk about his pilgrimage to Mecca via Cairo, the fact that he took whatever it was, 20,000 people who were enslaved, or whatever, that many thousand it was, with him. These are kind of details that are kind of left out of why are they left out?
Professor, when I post comments like that, whenever there's somebody glorifying that, and I post a comment like what you just said, I don't get any likes on it. Nobody.
Well, you see, this is the problem of the 21st century. You can't go around just worrying about how many likes and shares you get. But it's true. But that doesn't diminish the developments which would have taken place in Mali at that time, or the wealth of the overall GDP, if you like, of that kingdom. Or in fact, it was one of the biggest in the world. But on what basis? So these are things that have to be understood. And, as far as the Pan-African movement is concerned, one of the issues about the Pan-African movement in its early periods, up until the mid-1920s, was that it had the character very much of appealing to the colonial powers. If we look at the work of Du Bois and the work of Marcus Garvey to a large extent, they differed in the sense that Garvey, developed a kind of mass movement, and Du Bois much more organizing amongst intellectuals and so on. But in many, many ways, they were similar in that they appealed to the colonial powers. Okay, wouldn't it be better if you did this? Why don't you give these former colonies of Germany to us, and we'll administer them as a black state in the middle of Africa and all this kind of thing? So these are appeals. So when those with a different perspective came into the Pan-African movement, and I'm talking those who came from the communist movement, who were communists from Africa or from the US or from the Caribbean or from wherever, and said, well, actually what needs to be done is first we need to organize ourselves, and we need to organize ourselves to struggle, and we need to struggle alongside all those who are struggling in the world against the imperialist system of states. This is what's going to bring us success in the long run. And cutting a long story short, we then see that adopted that approach adopted by the Pan-African movement and the famous Manchester Congress in 1945. What were its essential characteristics? First, it's based on the masses of the people. It says, George Padmore actually wrote to the Bois and said, we want a Congress of the masses. We no longer want professors and intellectuals or the masses of the people no longer need them telling us what to do. So everybody there was a representative of a trade union, a workers' organization, a farmers' organization, and so on. So this concept that the masses of the people should be the determining factor was very, very important. Secondly, they said that the masses of the people are like the key force which is going to bring colonial rule to an end. And we intellectuals need to get behind them and help organize them, but that is the force that's going to bring this change. And of course, they said various other things as well. So these ideas that in politics, the masses of the people, the wealth producers are a key force that needs to be organized were very, very important. If we look at the subsequent history of anti-colonial struggle, just as we take Ghana as an example. So when Nkrumah returned after the Manchester Congress,
yes,
and organized people in positive action, all this kind of thing, again, it was the workers, it was the farmers,
absolutely,
it was the women who brought Britain to or the British government to the negotiating table, we can say, and in other places as well. In Kenya, it was the farmers and working people who organized against British colony, and elsewhere in Algeria, and in many other instances.
Yes.
The issue, though, to go back to the sister's question, is what then happened. So as colonialism is being ushered out the door, their confusion sets in.
Yeah.
So Nkrumah famously said, seek ye first the political kingdom, and all will be rendered unto you. But whose political kingdom are you seeking? If you adopt the political kingdom of your enemies, as he did, then you are basically excluding that very force which brought you to, which is the mass of the people, and you actually push them out, and then it creates disaster, and we can all see the disaster. If we look at, the example I gave earlier of Guinea-Bissau, you have the same. It's the masses of the people that organized to get rid of Portuguese colonialism. What happens on the
flip side?
As that is being realized, again, some other political system is adopted and the masses of the people are pushed out of things. And we can see that over and over again in South Africa and so on. So this is where you could say it's not really a conception of class as such, although you could look at it like that. It's more what is the force which is actually going to transform things and which needs to be unleashed in order that these countries are strong, that everything is centered around the people, that the economy is centered around the interests of the people, not some foreign interests, but the interests of the majority of the people. So these are really the key questions. And if that isn't done, it's disaster. And I'll just tell you an anecdote to conclude. I was at a conference years and years ago, an AU conference, and Museveni got up. I think it was Museveni. Anyway, it doesn't really matter who it was. And he said,
"That's Comrade Allimadi's hero."
It could have been. It was either him. They both said similar things. It was either Museveni or it was Wad, one or the other. Anyway, they basically said the same thing. He got up and he said, Bush was the president at that time, and he said, "When I go to the White House to speak to President Bush,
exactly,
I feel like a schoolboy visiting his headmaster." Now, this is the president of a country speaking in public. I mean, this is what can you say? This is disgrace. He's got no shame. But what it illustrates is, if he was the representative of the majority of people in Uganda, he would
not be able to say.
He'd say, "I'm here on behalf of my people," whatever. So this fact that this political system and these politicians actually represent people outside of the country more than they do their own people, weakens everything. And this is why this notion of the people, of organizing people, of putting the people at the center, of finding ways in which it's the majority of people that can empower themselves is such a key thing. And why, when people ask me about, the Sahelian states and all and so on and so forth and get very excited, I'm rather less excited because in these places, the majority of people are excluded from decision-making power.
Decision-making, okay.
Well, this is temporary and the conditions are not right and all various other things. But to me, these are kind of fundamental questions and fundamental of rights, that the people have rights, whatever you might think, and these rights are being denied. So anyway, I think these are very...
I think that's the best critique I've heard so far of the Sahelian states.
If I may ask a follow-up question to that. So we see the labor unions, if you will, being really active, the Negro newspaper that Padmore was the editor for and so on. And then there's this break. And then a rewriting, if you will. And then you bring up what we're seeing post-colonialism in Africa. What was informing that break, and how do we overcome that today?
You mean the break? You mean the personal break of Padmore, or the more general?
Yeah, it seemed like it was a personal break, but then, as we often do, he took it from just being a personal break to, okay, now there is a major division between, quote unquote, Pan-Africanism and communism, at least in the way that they had functioned, although they were separate tracks, but they seem to have they were running on parallel tracks, it seems, unless I'm totally misunderstanding it.
No, I mean, it's a very complicated period, you could say, because there also were changes going on in the communist movement at the time, which were kind of fundamental changes, which make it very difficult. However, I think the key change really was the one that there are a number of things. One is the whole situation of the Cold War. The whole pressure of the Cold War was on these states and on these individuals. And so you see even the most kind of enlightened people, like Nkrumah, distancing themselves from, for example, organizations like the World Federation of Trade Unions, for example, because it was seen as being, communist dominated or dominated by the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, there's a whole history in that period of the imperialist powers, splitting all these international movements and demonizing those who were connected with them. And so that also had its impact within some of these anti-colonial movements, that they wanted to present themselves as having nothing to do with anything, that was connected with communism, with the Soviet Union, with anything, and so forth. That meant sometimes that individuals were purged, we could say, sometimes organizations, and I think in people's thinking, there was the idea that we have the whole idea of the non-aligned movement, which somebody once said, anyway, wasn't really non-aligned, but the idea there's a kind of third way, you could say. There's some other way that these things can be done. And I think that was problematic. You might have had a problem with the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe or whatever. That's quite understandable perhaps. But that shouldn't mean that you have a problem with the idea that, as I said earlier, that the key is the empowerment of the masses of the people, of building political and economic systems that center on the needs of the majority. And I think as part of the kind of weight and influence of Cold War ideology, I think that was essentially what happened, or there was pressure that couldn't be resisted in that way. So that was very problematic, and in some ways we haven't quite recovered from that yet. And even where, as we've seen recently, in South Africa would be a very good example. Even those movements that maintained some of their connections with the Soviet Union or with Cuba or anyway, with that kind of politics, when they came to power, they went down the same path. They adopted the capital-centered system. They adopted representative democracy. And so what that means is that fundamentally nothing changes. That those who have economic power retain economic power. That it's much easier for external forces to control the political parties, to corrupt, to intervene in all sorts of ways, which are well known. And so today we have a situation where, South Africa is arguably the biggest or second biggest economy in Africa, but it can't provide electricity for its inhabitants, leaving aside housing and everything else that it can't provide. And it's not accidental in those circumstances that you have the, chauvinism and we can say anti-Africanism that is currently manifesting itself, because these are diversions from looking at what the actual problem in the country is.
Absolutely.
So I think those are some of the issues, but it's a very important question. I was actually going to write about it, and then I got diverted into writing something else. But it's a very important thing to look into, I think, what happened in that period, basically the post-war period, 45 to whatever,
60.
onward. Yeah, or even beyond, but certainly in that period, it's very, very important. There are some very interesting developments, one of which was the struggle that broke out in northern Ethiopia, led by the Tigray People's Liberation Front. That is important historically because at that time, the military government in Ethiopia, the Derg, was backed by the Soviet Union. And yet you had these organizations, particularly the TPLF, I suppose also Eritrea, the EPLF and others, fighting against the Soviet Union backed and even Cuba backed governments, but doing so with the perspective that they needed to organize amongst the masses of the people, that the people needed to empower themselves and so on and so forth. So actually looking at what happened, and they were successful. It doesn't matter who these people say they are or who they back. We want to free ourselves. We are organized in this way because we think this is the way things should be organized and we can be successful. And again, going back to what I said earlier, this way of organizing amongst the masses of the people, involving people, participatory democracy at the lowest level, all of these things, again, are very, very successful and work. But unfortunately, when they're on the verge of coming to power, all this is swept aside and the system the exploiters is adopted.
I think as Cabral famously said, how do we get the bourgeoisie to commit suicide, right? How do we get them out of the way of preventing the progress? Adesoji, I don't think you posed the question yet.
Yeah, I did at the beginning, but I've been in listening mode. My next question would be, we saw post-2020, Black Lives Matter, which became some sort of a global phenomenon. And one can say that is a manifestation of Pan-Africanism in itself, because you saw the linking of the struggle in the United States with the history of the United Kingdom, with what happened in Bristol and what have you. So, but part and parcel of that was the organizations, the institutions then deciding, yes, we need to do something. And doing something meant opening up their doors to the people they didn't normally open their doors to. And we saw in the last couple of days in the UK, the fervent attack on an academic, the late Dr. Jason Ade. Now, the question is that how do we counter that kind of problem? Because has been manifesting. We saw that with Professor Claudine Gay in Harvard. We've seen that across the United States in terms of universities. We've seen that here as well in the media. So the question would be, as a Pan-African.
We've seen that with Professor Adi's own program.
Yeah, I know. So, I mean, we are minded or mindful of the time. So could you just give us how do we counter this? Because it's online. The press has done it so much so that even they're outside the family home of the person you've just literally lynched, as it were. So how do we counter that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you could say it's an act of terrorism. It's using terror for political purposes. Whether anybody will be charged under what goes for the so-called anti-terrorism laws in the US, I very much, in Britain, I very much doubt. But I think it's important to kind of see it in that way. As you also indicated, it's a kind of formula of attack, or it's a kind of racist attack that's been tried and tested in the US and has now been imported into Britain, we can say, in this particular form. And as has also been said, it's just the kind of most tragic example of the kind of attacks which are launched within academia. And it is very, very, very tragic. I think that people are already organizing in various ways, calling on government to make public inquiries and the things that some people call for, which generally lead to nothing. I think what's very important is that people organize themselves, not just to mourn in this particular case, but to defend all those programs in academia that currently exist. And when I say that means everybody, not just Africans, but all kind of democratic people should do that, because once one or some individuals are attacked, that then opens the attack for all sorts of other people as well. And the fact that some people might think that, this attack has succeeded in various ways because the institutions involved seem to be on the defensive rather than going on the attack, as it were. They seem to be on the defense, especially the academic institutions. But it raises lots of issues, lots of questions about what kind of universities we require. Again, it raises questions about decision-making powers, who makes the decisions and in whose interests. One of the key things about Cambridge, for example, was that it had such a poor record in matters related to diversity, inclusion, etc., that it then felt it had to go and make a statement. And we've seen how that statement has concluded and so on. That the person that was essentially used to make a statement for Cambridge has, tragically died. So I think it's, as I say, it ushers in the need for much more organizing around these educational matters at all levels. You mentioned my own course and what happened to that. And that obviously had the effect of meaning that I lost my job. And you could say I'm still unemployed as a result of it. But even more importantly, the 12 students that I was supervising at master's and PhD level have not finished their courses, are still without supervision, have basically been, thrown to the gutter, as it were. And a course that was specifically designed to encourage mature students of African and Caribbean heritage into history, a subject in which there is a particularly low level of students of that type, even younger students. So it was to remedy that situation, has been destroyed, and therefore there's no longer any similar course encouraging these particular students to come into the discipline. So I think people need to take all this into account. And there are other courses and other individuals who have been under attack as well. So it requires people to organize all the time to take up these and other related questions for solution, because we could look at, how our kids treated in schools? Why is there a problem in certain subjects about, in history, for example, very few young people studied at university level and even fewer at postgraduate level. So why is that? What's going on? So it needs, as all things, it needs organizing. It needs people taking things into their own hands, of developing alternatives, of demanding that education meets our needs. Again, it's how to get to the stage where things are people-centered. At the moment, they're not people-centered. They're about making money. They're about developing certain types of knowledge, which is not in our interests or even the interests of the majority of people. So how to transform that? And it's only by organizing, demanding change, highlighting where these problems exist and finding ways collectively of solving these problems. And in particular, not relying on those who are causing the problem. So when people demand public inquiries, this is a tried and tested method of British governments to hide things, to shelve things, to divert attention for 3 years or whatever it is. That's not to say that necessarily is there shouldn't be a public inquiry, but that's not the only thing. We can't rely on these things. We have to find the ways of realizing our demands, of changing the situation. And again, you mentioned 2020 and so on, where there appear to be these loopholes, but they don't necessarily favor us. They're open for a time and then they're closed and situations become even worse. So again, not being diverted, not being fooled, finding ways of developing our own mechanisms, our own institutions, our own ways of keeping an eye on all these things, having an impact in these things, making decisions about things. These, I think, are the key things. And I hope in this case, people will, learn those lessons. There's a lot of goodwill, a lot of sympathy, a lot of concern, but it has to be channeled into something constructive, something that's going to make a difference, that's going to, peter out. And the most difficult thing is to build something, to keep something going, even with our concerns over the number of young people who study history. We tried to build something, a young historians project. 10 years later, 11 years later, we're still going. Well, what impact have we made? Well, many of our members went on to do PhDs, to study history, to become curators, to become whatever it was. So we have to build things that can make a difference and can move things in our favor and in the direction we want them, I think is a key thing.
Yeah, thank you. I would allow comrades to close out. He has...
Well, I was thinking, the 1945 conference in Manchester was so monumental. What are your thoughts, perhaps, that we need another version of that? And now we need to let people know that the World Bank and the IMF have substituted for the old imperial colonial powers. And essentially, they're performing the same functions by keeping the African world, whether on the continent, in the Caribbean, dependent on the old system, but using new mechanisms. What are your thoughts on that?
And before you answer that, can I tack onto that question? And given that question, how do you see the AU's 2026 announcing that 2026 through 2036 will be the decade of reparations and reframing Pan-Africanism around material restorative justice?
Okay.
Whatever part you can handle, because we know this is a dissertation. It's a dissertation question.
Well, it's, they're obviously interconnected issues, very much so. I think the difficulty with, say, both questions or both issues is again, it's always a question of decision makers. Who are the decision makers? So with the Congress, we just had a 9th Congress in Lomé just last year, but the question is, firstly, who knows anything about it? What did it discuss? who went there, who was invited, by whom. So at least with the 1945 Congress, and one can criticize it from various perspectives, but you were very clear on who was there, who they represented, and what they were concerned with, and so on. And I think this is problematic today, and it's one of the characteristics of this kind of period of Pan-Africanism. It manifests itself very well with the global African reparations movement. In that, I better be careful what I say here, but anyway, let's put it this way. We have reparations movements of various kinds.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the key questions you could say is, what does reparation mean? What is reparatory justice? And I often think this is the key question that nobody really discusses or seems to be left behind, because to me, one of the first aspects of reparatory justice is that the harm, which is ongoing, has to cease. So if you're demanding reparatory, that should be the first thing that is required. And then you might say, well, the fact that this movement is led by governments, particularly those in Africa and the Caribbean, what are they themselves doing to carry out some repair within their own countries? For example, having the broadest discussions amongst the people as to what people think should be reparatory justice. And the answer is no. So that's problematic, first of all. Then the other thing about the kind of global movement is there is a kind of state-led manifestation of it. And then there are those working on the ground in Europe, in the US, in parts of Africa and the Caribbean and so on, who are not necessarily well represented in these various conferences that take place in various places, is one. But the kind of ongoing, the demands of the people, to put it simply, are not central to these discussions which are going on with the AU, with CARICOM and others. I think that's problematic, and we need to find a way. When I say we, maybe those of us who are not in government, we need to find ways of making our concerns, our views known. And again, this goes back to all of these questions of the nature of states and the fact that they essentially exclude people from decision-making and even from discussion. And I suppose how we in the diaspora, because we're part of the sixth region of the AU, how we can flex our muscles, as it were, to at least develop mechanisms so that the diaspora is represented. And we do have that impact on, because the diaspora is, is quite important, even though it's only one region. It is quite important. And of course, financially, the diaspora is very, very important. And you could say, there should be, no remittances without representation, maybe, or something along those lines. But anyway, that there should be a mechanism. I think this is a legitimate demand of the diaspora. Firstly, how is the diaspora represented in the AU? That's the first question, which has to be resolved. And then the second question is, how should the diaspora be represented in these discussions on reparations? Because I think if the diaspora is in some ways maybe in a better position to demand decision-making powers or a different form of representation than those who are currently in the Caribbean or in Africa, although perhaps not necessarily, but those of us who are not in Africa or the Caribbean, in other words, in Europe or in North America, may be in a better position to make demands, to find the machinery which is more democratic and can make a contribution in that way. But I think that's very essential. And I just came from a reparations meeting in Europe just last weekend, where these are the kind of issues that were being discussed. But they need to be more discussed and ways found, which is always, what the struggle is, ways found to democratize everything, to make it more participatory, to bring the masses of the people at the center of things. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Prof. You've been listening to Professor Hakim Adi, and he is the author of Pan-Africanism, A History, amongst others. We've put the other list of, that's another one. What's the name of that one?
And Sankofa, DC has a lot of copies of this book, so go get one.
Go get your copy.
Well, that's good to hear. That's very good to hear, because there was a time when Sankofa couldn't get hold of it.
Wow.
Yes. I was just there couple of weeks ago, and they had some on the shelf.
Okay.
Brilliant.
So I must thank the good Prof taking a good time out of his very busy schedule to sit and talk with us. And
Adesoji, I got to ask one last question, pretty please. Prof, how do we support you? No, because you've been doing this work, and
thank you.
A lot of times people like you are at the forefront, and you take the brunt of the racism and all the other ways that they try to erase us. So for people who are watching, who are saying, we really want to support you, of course, yes, we can buy your books. But if anyone has ever published a book, you know that these people take most of the money.
Right.
So, but it's helpful to purchase the books. But how can we support you in the work that you're doing?
Well,
and
I think that you're very kind, and just your comments and your support are very supportive, and that's it's my duty. So from that point of view, I don't need support in that sense. But I think my students definitely need support, or my former students who are still looking for universities. If anybody is involved with a university or knows people who can help them, we originally wanted to try and keep them together as a cohort. We found that very, very difficult to do. There are about 7 PhD students and about 5 master's students who need to complete their course, their master's program, their PhD program. So anybody who can assist them in any way possible, that would be very, very, very helpful. But yeah, that's what I would say.
I think you should provide your email contact, Professor, if they wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very easy to find. You can on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, or you can email me at my LSE address, adi@lse.ac.uk. That will get to me. But I'm very easy to find. A lot of people contact me on Instagram, on Facebook. You can contact me via my website, hakimadi.org. I'm everywhere, nearly.
Yes. Thank you, Prof. Thank you. Comrade, do you have an announcement to?
Yeah. As many of our viewers and supporters know, Howard University, my beloved Howard, has been experiencing serious financial stress. As a result, I'm not even sure if I'll be able to attend this semester. There are issues with the fellowship, unfortunately. So I have actually just launched a GoFundMe campaign to support my Harvard University fellowship. And I believe Adesoji has a link to that.
Yeah, I'll put that in the comment section of the...
So hopefully I will still be able to attend, even if I'm a week late this semester. Otherwise, surely I will be back in the spring semester. So I wanted to share that with our comrade.
Okay. Again,
Sister, you look too shocked. What's going on?
No, because, it comes back to the comments that Professor Adi was making just in terms of decision makers.
Yeah.
If I just take one example, Howard University just got millions in unrestricted funds from Mackenzie Scott. Why are they not funding students? I mean, my daughter graduated from there, and quite frankly, and I'm going to say this publicly, Howard University, and I know they will come for me, Howard University is run like an African country. Very disrespectful to its own people.
Now, sister, don't be too harsh.
It's true.
Please.
No. I know this is apparent, and how many times we had to jump through hoops. So it's very annoying to me that even when they do get resources, and I know I don't understand the whole picture, but that even those unrestricted funds cannot go to assist kids. This is just a few weeks ago, they were disenrolling students.
Yes, that was in the media.
Who have been admitted and had been given misinformation and putting these students in a very tough predicament. So we just need to do better. when we're doing great, I'm going to be our biggest cheerleader. But when we need to do better, I'm going to call that out as well. But please, yes, let's support brother too.
All right, fair enough, sis.
Okay. I thought we were going to go out on a high, but
it's a high.
Struggle.
It's a high.
No. But Adesoji, you're wrong. Struggle is
it's a
on
high.
a
We
high.
have work.
As Professor Adi said, history is not static.
Can I just say, talking about a high, that you mentioned my books, that Pan-Africanism and Communism has just been republished by 1804 Books in New York and is available globally. And I would also announce, you were kind enough to mention some of my books have been translated. Pan-Africanism, a History, has actually been translated into French, into Spanish, into Portuguese, and into Arabic, and is soon to be translated into Mandarin as well. So for all readers of not all languages, but many languages, these books are available.
okay.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because it's been the most difficult thing has been to get translation into African languages. And I've tried. Kiswahili was one. I contacted people in Kenya and in Tanzania, didn't get anywhere. I was thinking also maybe it'd been translating into Amharic again, nowhere. Of course, it could be translated into Hausa and any other language. So if anybody wants to translate it into African languages, please, I would be delighted.
Wow.
Very different.
Professor Somé could probably help. Yoparika, we've had him on as well.
Well, have a word with him, ask, if people want to do it. Normally in the past, people have, for these, European languages or even in Arabic, people have just approached and said, oh, we'd love to translate it. But nobody from Africa has said we want to translate any of these things. So, yeah, this is, just recently somebody, wants to translate Pan-Africanism and Communism into Portuguese for a Brazilian edition. So people are always approaching for these languages, but African languages, nobody.
Wow.
As I say, we're even going to have a Mandarin translation. So it's going to be
an African language.
There's enough of us who speak African languages. We just need to add this to, as one of the things that needs to be done.
Please go ahead. If you can translate, please do. Please do.
Interesting.
Okay. So thank you again, Professor, for coming through. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Comrade Milton. And thank you to the audience as well for coming through. Until next week when we come back.
Where's the GoFundMe link?
No, I will pin it to the video at the end of the show. Yeah. So,
okay.
So, thank you very much for coming through. Thank you, everybody. And it's good night and God bless. That's a wrap for this week on the African News Review podcast. We hope you are leaving with a clearer, more truthful picture of Africa. Remember, every story has another side, and we're here to uncover it. Don't forget to join us next Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we continue to challenge the narratives and reclaim Africa's voice. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeing Africa for what it truly is.